Throughout the 19th century, women had the most challenging barriers to break through, the barriers of strict gender roles and stereotypes. This is a documentary about how suffragettes fought through ridicule, rejection, and resentment in order to achieve the ultimate success, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Women's suffrage campaigns first kicked off in the 1820s and 1830s, but the women were not very successful and the government paid no attention to their attempts. However, the campaign hit a turning point in 1848 through a gathering of women in Seneca Falls, New York. This meeting, called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, was later coined the Seneca Falls Convention. This meeting discussed the rights of women, unified them, and inspired them to start fighting for their rights. According to Judy Perry Martinez, president of the American Bar Association, the Seneca Falls Convention served as a guiding light for future generations of suffrage advocates. The women were spurred to start advocating for their right to vote. Their main argument was that it was unconstitutional, since all men and women were created equal. In 1850, two women, who would later be known as two of the most prominent leaders of the suffrage movement, were introduced: Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Together, they led the suffragettes through various protests and movements over the next 10 years. Just as the movement was building steam, the women were hit with a major setback: the beginning of the Civil War. Things started going downhill as attentions were shifted from the women to the men fighting in the war. The women were considered burdens, distractions, and even called unpatriotic and not true Americans for wanting to put their own needs over the war. Nevertheless, the women continued persevering and decided to become completely involved in the Civil War as nurses and volunteers in brigades. It was through their efforts and crucial roles in the war that the ideals of true womanhood began to expand for most Americans. After the war ended, women turned their interests back to the movement, and associations and groups started forming. Among the first was the National Women's Suffrage Association, started by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This was crucial to the movement because it drew more women to the cause and they gained a considerable amount of supporters. Another group called the National Women's Party began to emerge, founded by Alice Paul. The women started protesting and using more radical tactics, and as a result, were often beaten and arrested. Although it seemed the women were losing their battle, the public arrests and poor treatment of the women actually helped their cause. As historian Matthew Pinsker states, figures like Alice Paul pioneered tactics in direct action and attention-grabbing protests. The press coverage gained publicity for the women, and it was the fire that they needed to ignite the support for women's suffrage in America. While some Americans still had their hesitations about women involved in politics and away from the home, the women had gained too many supporters for them to be blocked from their goal yet again. The publicity was the last push that the women needed for the government to finally take them seriously, and on August 18, 1920, nearly a century after the movement began, Congress ratified the 19th Amendment. The legacy of the women's suffrage movement is prominent today, as women have become increasingly involved in not just voting, but in all aspects of politics. As we are approaching the 100th anniversary of the ratification, people around America are still honoring the legacy that these brave women have left behind by sacrificing their lives for the cause of the women's suffrage movement.